What if I told you that a blind millionaire's son opened his eyes for the first time in years? Not because of doctors, not because of expensive surgeries, but because of the gentle touch of a poor black maid who believed in something greater than money or medicine. What happened next left an entire mansion trembling with tears and shock. Stay with me until the end, and before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Gentle Words for more life-changing stories. The mansion stood at the edge of the city like a monument of power and wealth, with marble floors that echoed the footsteps of those who dared walk across them, walls covered in expensive art, and crystal chandeliers that glittered like falling stars even in daylight, but within those walls lived a sorrow that no amount of wealth could heal. The millionaire, Mr. Harold Kingsley, was a man who had conquered the world of finance, building empires of steel, oil, and banking, yet inside his heart he carried the heaviest defeat a father could bear, the blindness of his only son, Alexander. Born with bright eyes and a laugh that could melt stone, Alexander had once run through those hallways, chasing butterflies and holding his father's hand as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. But fate was cruel, and at the age of 8, a sudden illness stole his sight. Harold threw money at doctors across oceans, funded research, flew his boy to Paris, Switzerland, and America, but the answer was always the same: irreversible. His wife, unable to bear the heartbreak, drowned herself in parties and distant travels, leaving the boy to his own darkness and the father drowning in guilt, and so the mansion that looked like heaven from the outside had become a silent tomb inside. In the middle of this despair entered a woman no one had expected to change anything, a maid named Rosa, a black woman in her 40s who had seen her share of hardship but carried a quiet strength in her soul. She had grown up poor, raised on faith by a grandmother who believed that hands could heal if they carried love. And though Rosa had no diploma on her wall, no doctor's title before her name, she carried with her something that money couldn't buy: compassion. Rosa had been hired not for her skills but out of necessity. The Kingsleys needed staff, and she needed a job to feed her 2 children back in the small neighborhood where rent ate up most of her paycheck. At first, she kept to her duties, cleaning, polishing, serving silently, like every other servant in that house. But unlike the others, she noticed the boy, Alexander, who sat by the window every afternoon, his eyes open but vacant, staring at a world he could no longer see. Many ignored him, some pitied him, but Rosa, every time she passed by, whispered a small prayer under her breath. One day, as she polished the table in the grand library, she heard the boy's voice, soft, trembling, but filled with a question that pierced her soul: "Do you think God forgot me?" She froze, her cloth in hand, her heart twisting, for she remembered asking the same thing as a little girl when her own mother had died. She walked toward him slowly and knelt beside his chair. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice steady, "God never forgets his children. Sometimes he just waits for the right moment to show us his power." From that day, a bond formed between Rosa and Alexander. She told him stories, sang him old hymns her grandmother used to hum, and when loneliness shadowed his heart, she held his hand so he knew someone was still there. The mansion staff frowned at her closeness. Servants were to serve, not mingle, but Alexander laughed for the first time in years because of Rosa, and no one dared stop her. Weeks turned into months, and Rosa noticed something peculiar. When she wiped his face with warm cloths after mealtime, Alexander said he could feel tingles around his eyes, like sparks dancing on his skin. The doctors had told Harold that there was no hope, but Rosa's grandmother had always spoken of a natural balm made from herbs and oils that could awaken sleeping eyes. Skeptical yet desperate to ease the boy's sadness, Rosa began rubbing Alexander's eyes gently with her palms every evening, humming softly as she worked. "Why do you do that?" he asked once. She smiled and said, "Because love sometimes works where medicine fails." He didn't understand, but he trusted her. One stormy night, as rain battered the windows and thunder roared like drums of war, Alexander cried in Rosa's arms. "I just want to see the stars again," he sobbed, "even if just once." Rosa, her own tears mingling with his, whispered, "Then let's pray for a miracle." She rubbed his eyes again, firmer this time, her palms warm against his skin, her voice trembling as she sang an old hymn. Suddenly, Alexander gasped. His body jerked, his eyes fluttered, and he whispered, "Light, I see light." Rosa's heart nearly stopped. She pulled back and looked at him, his pupils moved, tiny and uncertain, but moving. He clutched her hands and shouted, "I see your face." It's blurry, but I see. The boy screamed with joy, and the noise brought servants rushing in, followed by Harold himself. At first, Harold scolded Rosa, demanding what she had done, fearing harm, but then he saw his son, who had lived in darkness for 10 years, staring at him with trembling eyes and crying, "Father, is that you?" The proud, iron-hearted millionaire fell to his knees, his sobs shaking the room. He grabbed his boy, holding him like he had never let him go, whispering, "Yes, son, it's me, oh God, it's me." The news spread like wildfire inside the mansion. Doctors were called immediately, and though none could explain the sudden return of sight, they confirmed it. Alexander could indeed see again. The staff murmured in awe, but Harold, for the first time in his life, was humbled. He turned to Rosa, his eyes swollen with tears, and whispered, "I spent millions looking for a cure, but it was your hands, your faith, that brought my son back to me. How can I ever repay you?" Rosa shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and said softly, "Sir, you don't owe me anything. I only gave him what God gave me, love." From that day forward, the Kingsley mansion changed. Alexander no longer sat in darkness but ran through the halls again, chasing the sunlight, laughing with a joy that healed the cracks in his father's soul. Harold no longer looked at Rosa as a maid but as the woman who restored his family's hope. He offered to pay for her children's education, to lift her family out of poverty, but Rosa asked only one thing: "Promise me you'll never let your son forget that his healing came not from money, but from love." Harold kept that promise. And so, the impossible had happened, not in hospitals, not in laboratories, but in the quiet faith of a poor black maid who believed that sometimes miracles are not bought but born from the hands that care. And before we close this story, remember, if this tale touched your heart and reminded you of the power of love and faith, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Gentle Words, where stories of hope and miracles live on. The days following Alexander's miracle were filled with laughter that the Kingsley mansion had not heard in more than a decade. Every corner echoed with his footsteps as he rediscovered the world his eyes had long forgotten, the deep blue of the sky, the golden rays of sunlight spilling through tall windows, the delicate colors of flowers in the garden he once could only touch. For Harold, each moment was a treasure. He followed his son like a shadow, marveling at the way Alexander pointed excitedly at butterflies, or stared in awe at his own reflection in the mirror. To Harold, wealth meant nothing compared to that. Just seeing his son's eyes alive again was worth more than his empire. But amid the joy, questions arose. Doctors and specialists flooded the mansion, eager to examine the boy, some disbelieving the miracle, others desperate to write papers about it. They pricked, scanned, and tested Alexander until he begged them to stop. Harold, though proud, noticed the boy's unease. "Father," Alexander whispered one night as Harold tucked him in, "don't let them take this away from me. I don't want to be an experiment. I just want to be me." Harold's chest tightened. He kissed his son's forehead and promised, "No one will ever take this from you again." And he meant it. While the world marveled, Rosa continued her quiet life in the mansion, returning each morning with her humble uniform, her hands worn but gentle. She refused interviews, ignored the whispers of staff who envied her newfound favor, and spent her spare moments writing letters to her children, telling them how Alexander's joy reminded her of them. Yet, Harold could not ignore her presence. Time after time, he found himself watching her, how she carried herself with dignity despite her lowly status, how she comforted not just Alexander but even the staff when they were weary. She had become the silent glue that held his broken household together. And deep within his heart, Harold felt something he hadn't in years: respect and gratitude that stirred into something more tender. One evening, Harold invited Rosa to his study. The room smelled of cedarwood and old books, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had built the Kingsley Empire. Harold stood by the fireplace, nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a young man. "Rosa," he began, his voice faltering, "I have given bonuses, houses, cars, even stocks to people in my company. But for you, none of that feels enough. You gave me back my son. Tell me, what do you want most in this life?" Rosa looked down, her hands clasped. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, softly, she said, "All I've ever wanted was for my children to have the life I never had. Education, dignity, and the chance to rise without being judged by the color of their skin or the weight of their pockets." If you can promise me that, sir, then I need nothing more. Harold's throat tightened. In all his years, he had dealt with the richest, greediest people in the world, yet here was a woman who had been offered a kingdom and asked only for her children's chance at a future. That night, Harold made a decision. He arranged full scholarships for Rosa's children, placed money in a trust for their future, and offered Rosa a position not as a maid, but as part of his household's leadership. When Rosa tried to refuse, Harold insisted, "You are family now. And family does not serve, they stand beside." Tears streamed down Rosa's cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you, sir." But Harold shook his head. "No, Rosa. Thank you." Alexander, too, changed. Having lived in darkness, he now saw beauty in the simplest things: sunsets, birds, even raindrops racing down the glass. Yet he also noticed the world's ugliness, the way some staff sneered at Rosa behind her back, the whispers that mocked her color and her humble beginnings. One afternoon, Alexander confronted a butler who had made a cruel remark. "You think she's just a maid," Alexander said, his voice sharp, "but she's the reason I can see your face right now. Without her, I'd still be in darkness. If you can't respect her, then you don't belong here." The butler left in shame, and word spread quickly. From that moment, no one dared disrespect Rosa again. Months passed, and the bond between the three grew unshakable. Harold found in Rosa not only a healer but a confidant, someone who saw beyond his wealth into the tired, guilty man within. Alexander, blossoming into a young man, saw Rosa as the mother he had longed for when his own had abandoned him to sorrow. They became a family born not of blood but of love, stitched together by a miracle no one could explain. But life, as it often does, tested them again. One cold winter, Alexander fell ill with a fever so fierce that the doctors feared it might damage his fragile eyesight once more. Harold nearly lost his mind, pacing the hallways, demanding answers, while Rosa sat by the boy's bed day and night, holding his hand, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, and whispering prayers. "Don't take this from him again, Lord," she begged, "not after you've given it back." For days, the boy drifted between sleep and pain, his voice weak. Then, one night, as snow blanketed the mansion grounds, Alexander opened his eyes and whispered, "Rosa, I can still see you." Relief flooded the room, and Rosa wept into his sheets, whispering thanks. It was in that moment Harold realized something profound. All his money, all his power, all his pride had never been able to give him what Rosa had given. He took her hands in his, right there by his son's bedside, and said, "Rosa, I once thought miracles were bought. Now I know they are given, through people like you. You are the greatest gift my life has ever known." Rosa tried to pull her hands back, embarrassed, but Harold held on. And for the first time in years, Rosa allowed herself to cry not just from pain or exhaustion, but from joy, the joy of being seen, truly seen, by the man who once looked past her as if she were invisible. The seasons changed, and with them, so did the Kingsley household. Gone were the days of silence and sorrow, in their place came music, laughter, and faith. Alexander grew stronger, his eyes brighter each day, and often he would sit with Rosa under the garden trees, sketching what he saw, her smile, the flowers, even the birds overhead, because he never wanted to forget the gift he'd been given. Harold, humbled and softened, became a man his employees barely recognized, no longer a ruthless tycoon, but a father and a leader who knew that true wealth was not measured in gold but in the lives touched by love. And so, the story of a blind boy and a maid became more than a household secret. It became a legacy, whispered through the city, told in hushed tones in churches, spoken of in neighborhoods where hope was rare. Some called it fate, others called it faith, but all agreed, it was love that had made the impossible possible. On a quiet spring evening, as the sun set in hues of orange and purple, Alexander stood in the garden with Rosa and Harold by his side. He looked up at the sky, tears filling his eyes, and whispered, "I can see the stars again." Rosa smiled, her own heart full, and Harold placed his arm around them both. And in that moment, beneath the endless sky, they were not millionaire, maid, or child, they were simply family, bound by a miracle that had forever changed their lives. And dear listener, if this story has touched your heart and reminded you that love is the true miracle, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to Gentle Words, where stories of hope, faith, and healing are shared to inspire souls just like yours.